Have you ever really stopped to think about, the gears turning behind finance, how different systems tackle something as basic as debt or credit? And what happens when, let's say, deeply held beliefs like religious principles meet the real world of financial contracts? Well, today, that's exactly what we're digging into. We're exploring Sharia standard number 37 on credit agreements. Now, respected Islamic legal scholars setting guidelines. And our mission today, pretty simple, really, give you a clear path, a shortcut to understanding Islamic credit facilities. We want to highlight what makes them different, maybe even surprising.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, I think, is that this standard, it doesn't just define things. It really spells out the how and the why of Sharia-compliant credit. It's meant to guide the banks, the institutions, make sure ethics are baked right in. So in this deep dive, we'll look at what these facilities cover, the different kinds you find, both, traditional and Islamic, and maybe most importantly, the specific rules, especially around fees and returns. That's key.
Okay, so let's start right there. Credit facilities. It sounds big. What exactly are we talking about here? Like, can you give an example of something that is a credit facility under the standard that might surprise people and maybe something common people think is credit but isn't?
That's a great starting point because, yeah, the term is wider than you might first think. The standard itself defines credit pretty simply. It's a financial deal that creates a debt one party owes another. Simple. But credit facilities, that's the umbrella term. It covers more than just handing over cash. They break it down broadly into two types. First, cash facilities. That's pretty straightforward, right? The bank gives you funds, maybe actual cash, for something specific, like a direct loan. Then you've got incidental facilities. These are things where the institution takes on a potential sort of contingent obligation. A good surprising example, maybe a bank guarantee. No money changes hands right away, but the bank is promising to pay later if something goes wrong. That's an incidental obligation. And what's not a credit facility, this trips people up sometimes. It's those immediate, on-the-spot transactions. Think buying groceries. You pay, you get the goods. Right there. No future debt. No obligation created. So not a credit facility by this definition.
Oh, okay. That difference between immediate exchange and a future obligation, that seems really central. So let's say an institution, a bank, decides, okay, we're willing to offer these facilities. How does that work formally? It's not just a casual chat, I assume. How do they approve it? And then how does the client actually, start using it?
No, definitely not casual. It's quite structured. It starts with what they call the approval of credit facilities. This is basically the institution saying, yes, we agree in principle to offer this facility to you, the client. It lays out all the key details, the maximum amount, so the financial limit, how long the facility is good for, the term, and any conditions. Things like guarantees needed, how repayment works, any rules they have to follow. Often there's a letter involved, but it usually clarifies that this approval isn't the final commitment, not until the client actually uses it. And things like renewing or extending an existing facility, they follow pretty much the same approval steps.
Right. So the approval sets the stage, defines the boundaries. It's like getting the potential is there. But how does that potential turn into, actual money moving or services happening? What flips the switch for the client?
That's the next step. The utilization of credit facilities. This is purely client-driven. The client has to initiate it. So they might formally ask the bank, okay, issue that guarantee letter we talked about, or I need that letter of credit now. Or maybe they submit a request saying, I want to buy this specific asset using the Murabaha facility you approved, or I want to lease this equipment through Ijara.
Yeah.
It's the client taking action, drawing down on that approved facility. That's what makes it real.
Okay, now this feels like where things get really distinct. The standard talks about different types of facilities. And you mentioned the contrast between traditional banking and Islamic finance is huge here. Can you kind of walk us through that landscape? Maybe grouping them helps see the core differences?
Well, absolutely. And you're right. Looking at them side by side makes the fundamental differences in approach really clear. The end goal might look similar, sometime getting funds using an asset, but the how is worlds apart. It mostly comes down to avoiding interest, or riba. That's the cornerstone. So let's look at traditional credit facilities first. The kind you see in conventional banks. A lot of these are built around lending money and charging interest. You've got your standard loans or credit. Here's the lump sum. Pay it back by this date plus interest. Pretty basic. Then overdrafts. Use our money up to this limit. Withdraw when you need it. Pay interest on whatever you've borrowed. Discounted papers. This is where the bank buys things like bills of exchange at a discount. Essentially paying less now for a future payment, which includes an implied interest. And credit cards. Big one. Get a card. Spend up to a limit. If you don't pay it all back right away, you pay interest. The standard calls it oifkate on the balance. That interest component is a massive difference. And there are some traditional facilities that are maybe more service-based, but still within that conventional interest framework.
Letters of credit, used a lot in trade. The bank promises to pay someone on your behalf when certain documents are presented. Bank acceptances. The bank promises to pay a specific amount on a future date related to some commercial paper. Bank guarantees. The bank issues a promise to pay a third party if you, the client, fail to meet an obligation. Now, let's switch gears to Islamic credit facilities. The absolute key here, they are all based on specific Shari'ah-compliant contracts. They build different structures to get to similar economic places, but without interest. We can maybe group these into a couple of buckets. First, trade-based contracts and asset financing. Here, the institution is actually dealing with real assets, taking some risk related to those assets. Murabaha and Musawama, these are both sale contracts. The bank buys an asset you need and sells it to you. With Murabaha, the bank must tell you its cost and the profit margin it's adding. It's cost plus. With Musawama, they don't disclose the cost, you just negotiate and agree on a final price, like regular haggling. Ijara, leasing. The institution buys an asset, could be equipment, property, and then leases it to you for a set period. So you get the use of the asset. There are different types, operating and financial, but the core is leasing. Istisna, manufacturing. This is for when you need something custom built, a building, specialized equipment. The institution agrees to arrange for its manufacture or construction according to your specs. They might use a parallel istisna contract with the actual builder. Salam, forward sale. Think agriculture or commodities. You need money now for expenses, but your goods, crops for example, won't be ready until later. The institution pays you now for a promise of future delivery of specified goods. They can also do a parallel salam to sell those goods onward. Second bucket, partnership and investment models. Here it's about sharing risk and potential profit. Mudaraba, profit sharing. One side provides the money, the capital, the other provides the expertise or labor management. If there are profits, they're shared based on an agreed ratio. If there's a loss, the capital provider bears it unless the manager was negligent. That's crucial. Mushaka, partnership. This is a joint venture. Both the institution and the client put in capital for a project or deal. They share profits and losses based on agreed percentages. Diminishing musharaka is a cool variation where the client gradually buys out the institution's share over time. And finally, there are other operations that fit within the Islamic framework under certain rules, like Card Hasan, which is essentially a benevolent loan, completely interest-free, or managing client overdrafts without charging interest. And yes, letters of guarantee and letters of credit can exist here too, but they must be structured compliantly, usually meaning the institution can only charge fees for the service or actual costs incurred, not make a profit on the guarantee itself.
Wow, okay. That breakdown is incredibly helpful. You really see how it's not just about finding a loophole around interest, but building entirely different types of financial relationships based on trade, assets, partnership, and risk sharing. So given that, what does Sharia say about the act of granting the facility itself? You mentioned the approval isn't the final contract. How does that fit? And are there just outright forbidden things?
Exactly. The distinction is important. The decision to grant the facility, that approval stage we talked about, Sharia views that mostly as a preliminary step. A non-binding promise or maybe an understanding to potentially enter into a specific transaction later. So the approval itself doesn't carry the full weight of, say, a completed sale contract's rules. But, and this is the key, the moment the client utilizes the facility, the moment it becomes an actual murabaha sale or an ijara lease or a musharaka partnership, then the specific Sharia rules for that particular contract fully apply. As for the definite no-nos, the standard is very clear under Sharia rulings. It is absolutely not permitted to engage in any traditional facility if it involves riba, plain and simple, or if it leads indirectly to an interest-based loan, or if it messes up the timing rules for currency exchange, delaying both sides is also a form of riba. That's the foundation. And it also clarifies rights. If the institution decides not to proceed with an approved facility for some reason, they don't owe the client compensation just for withdrawing the offer. And flip side, if the client gets approval but then decides not to use the facility within its valid time, they don't owe the institution anything either. It reinforces that the approval isn't the binding financial event itself. No profit just for promises.
Right. That makes sense. It avoids penalizing someone for changing their mind before a real transaction happens. Okay, now this next part, fees and returns. You said this is where things get really specific and may be surprising for people used to conventional banking. Let's really unpack this. What kind of charges are okay, and what's strictly forbidden when we're talking about these credit facilities from a Sharia perspective?
You got it. This is super detailed in the standard, and for very good reason. It's all about ensuring no hidden interest creeps in, and that fees are only for legitimate services or actual costs incurred. The standard neatly divides them. First, fees that might come up before you actually sign on the dotted line for the main financing contract. So, before entering the contract, what's permitted? Credit study fee. Makes sense, right? The institution does work to assess the client's creditworthiness. They can charge for that work, that service. And importantly, it's okay whether the application is approved or rejected. The study itself belongs to the client. Costs for contracts and forms. Preparing documents costs money, time, resources. So they can charge for the actual costs involved, and these can be split between the bank and client, as long as it's fair and agreed. Crowdfunding fee. If it's a crowdfunding setup, the platform organizing it can charge a fee for their service, usually paid by the participants. Feasibility study costs. If the client asks for a feasibility study for their project, the institution can charge for conducting it, assuming the fee is agreed up front. Again, it's a tangible service. Now, what's not permitted before the contract? This is where the principle of not profiting from mere promises comes in strongly. Granting fee. You absolutely cannot charge a fee just for saying yes to the facility for the approval itself. Renewal or extension fee, same logic applies here. Charging just to renew the approval or extend the offer period without an underlying transaction changing, not allowed. Seriousness, margin earnest money deposit. This is a nuanced one. They can't take this as a non-refundable fee up front just to show seriousness. However, if the client later backs out of the deal after promising and the institution suffers actual demonstrable damages because of that breach, they can recover the specific damages. It's about compensation for real loss, not a penalty or fee.
Okay, that distinction between charging for a service versus charging for the potential or the promise is really clear. So what about fees that arise when you actually enter the financing contract?
Right. Moving to, upon entering the financing contract, what's permitted here? Commitment fee. Now, this sounds tricky, but it can be permissible under specific conditions. It might be called a financing fee or similar. If it's genuinely a fee for the institution committing resources or keeping a line of credit open and available for the client to draw upon, it can be okay as long as it's clearly defined and not just disguised interest. The specifics matter a lot here. Down payment, our boon. This is allowed. It's like earnest money in conventional terms. If the buyer puts down a deposit but then decides not to go through with the purchase, exercising their right to cancel, the seller can keep the deposit. Agency fee in documentary credits. If the institution is acting as an agent to handle documentary credits, charging a fee for that agency service is fine. But here's where some major not permitted items come in, really highlighting core Shari'ah principles. Guarantee return commission. This is a big one. Institutions are not allowed to earn a profit or return simply for providing a guarantee, whether it's a documentary credit, letter of guarantee, or a bank guarantee.
They can charge for the actual direct administrative costs of processing the guarantee, but they cannot profit from the act of guaranteeing itself. It's seen as a supportive, not a profit-making function. Return on rescheduling deferring payment. Let's say a client is struggling to meet a payment on a Mirabaha contract. The institution cannot simply charge extra profit for giving them more time to pay. That looks too much like interest on late payment. They can charge for any actual direct cost associated with the administrative work rescheduling, but no additional profit on the original amount just for the delay. And crucially, renewing or extending facilities shouldn't be used as an excuse to just roll over existing contracts to effectively charge new profit on the old debt in this way. That's seen as circumventing the rules.
That point about rescheduling fees is particularly important, I think. It directly contrasts with how late fees or increased interest often work in conventional finance.
Exactly. It's about preventing the charging of extra money purely for the passage of time on a debt. And one final point related to security. The standard confirms that institutions are permitted to take guarantees to secure these facilities, but naturally, those guarantees themselves must be Shari'ah-compliant types. It ties everything together. The main deal, the fees, the security, all need to align with the principles.
So wrapping this up, what's the big picture for you, our listener, whether you're involved in business, finance, or just curious about how different systems work? This deep dive into Shari'ah Standard 37, it really paints a picture of the financial system trying very hard to align every transaction with a core set of ethical and religious values. You see it in how debt is defined, how contracts like Murabaha or Mudarabah are structured to involve assets or shared risk, and especially in those really detailed rules about what fees are okay and what fees are definitely not. It's a comprehensive roadmap for doing finance differently. Understanding these details is vital if you're navigating this world because it shapes everything, the products, the risks, the rewards.
And it leaves us with a pretty interesting thought, I think. When you look closely at any financial system, traditional or Islamic, what fundamental values are they really built on? What are they trying to achieve or protect? And how do those underlying values end up shaping the actual bank's accounts, loans, investments, all the financial tools that are available to us every day? Maybe even how we think about money itself.
Definitely something to chew on. We really hope this deep dive gave you some valuable insights, maybe sparked some new questions about how finance works around the world. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.